right. Hello, and welcome back to Faith Unaltered. I'm one of the co hosts here, Dale, and I'm joined by special co host, Caleb Johnston from Question Christianity. Hey, Caleb.
Hey, glad to be here, Dale.
Awesome. And Caleb, he's kind of organized a special treat for us tonight. We have a couple of guests here. We have Tyler Vela from the Freed Thinker podcast. So back to the show, Tyler.
Thank you. I just realized I should probably update the naming convention here there you go.
There you go.
To be uniform, right? My OCD will die if I keep seeing that. So we're all in place.
Now it's professional. Okay, good. Cool. So, and we also have joining the podcast Joel Furches. Hey, Joel, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. All right, awesome. So for today's topic, Caleb's the one who's kind of organized this show, and obviously it's not going to be a surprise to the audience. We have Tyler Vela on, and he's become famous in recent months because of his deconversion. So that's what the topic of today's show is. We're going to be kind of looking at Tyler's take and why he deconverted. And we also have Joel Furches on, who's an expert in this area. He's actually doing PhD research in deconversion. So they're going to be having a great conversation together there. But yeah, just before we get into the show and I turn the reins over to Caleb there, I just want to have each guest kind of take a couple minutes to introduce themselves to the audience and let us know who you guys are and stuff. So yeah, Joel, let's start with you.
Sure. So I am currently a PhD student in psychology, and I began in journalism. I ran a column, which was essentially a Christian column, and one month I decided to do a day-by-day series of publications doing human interest piece on atheists who had converted to Christianity. And it was by far the most popular thing I had ever published, to the point that it was being requested to be republished by organizations such as Premier Christianity in the UK and Ratio Christi. And so one of the feedback I got from atheists on that series was, why don't you do both sides and be even about it? Give both credit. Talk about the Christians who become atheists as well. Well, it wasn't an appropriate subject matter for a Christian column, but it was interesting to me as a researcher, especially once I saw the huge amounts of regular variabilities and similarities between the conversion stories that I did. So eventually I began to look into those stories, and I began to notice way more patterns and things. So I started looking to the research and eventually ended up developing a model for deconversion, after which I started my PhD work to do a dissertation on my findings.
Awesome. All right, cool. And Tyler, turning to you, just take a couple minutes to introduce the audience if they don't know who you are and a bit about your background as well.
Yeah, so I'm Tyler. I'm the host of the Freed Thinker podcast, YouTube channel, blog. And as you mentioned, recently deconverted from the Christian faith. I was a Reformed Presbyterian for not my entire Christian life, but a big chunk of it. I was probably a Reformed. I was a Christian for about 23 years, 24 years. I converted when I was about 20 years old, and was it was like in a non-denominational church for a while. As I developed in theology, became Reformed probably a couple of years after converting. And then a Presbyterian a few years after that, and had been doing that for quite some time. And the podcast was, and honestly still is, dedicated to religious philosophy, theology, biblical studies, and kind of any topic in those areas that I'm researching or I'm finding interesting at the time, or the discussions. Did a lot of apologetics, dealing with naturalism, the new atheism, and skeptical arguments against Christianity and the Bible, and so on and so forth. And then now, as of the past few months, find myself more on that side of the aisle for various different reasons. I'm sure we'll talk about some of those tonight. So yeah, happy to be here. And I should mention, Caleb and Joel and I have a long and wonderful history together. more so, Caleb towards the tail end of my time with Menstruals, but Joel and I hosted conferences together, did writing projects together. So just I don't undersay it when I say like this is these are highly respected people that I think I'm very 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 fond of to have this discussion with. So
awesome. All right, cool. Well, yeah, Caleb.
Back at you, Tyler.
Awesome, Caleb. Well, yeah, this is your baby kind of thing. So I want to kind of turn the reins over to you. I know you have a plan about the show, and I think we've got about an hour. So over to you.
Yeah, so I kind of want to start off. I really want the interaction between you guys to kind of get going. But first, Tyler, can you just give us kind of a rundown of where your current theology kind of sets?
Yeah, it's in flow. It's in flux, to be honest, right? So like most things, unweaving a tapestry has some I can see where the direction is going, but it has some unintended consequences, and it has other areas where I'm like, oh, I could see where the thread is going to get there eventually. I'm just not there. I haven't worked things out. I tend to not like, I tend to not like, strongly stating beliefs if I haven't been able to at least like research them to a certain degree and think about them and engage with some of the scholarship and things like that. So, I can see where certain things are going, but I'm still firmly planted in the theistic camp. So I'm still a theist, still a classical theist, although in the past, I would say in the past couple of weeks, there have been some components of that that I've gotten some very interesting challenges to, having to do specifically with aseity and omnibenevolence. So there's some interesting things to though where I used to be able to have scripture to fall back to and have that as kind of a buffer. Don't quite have that anymore, but I think for consistency's sake, those are entailed. It's just not quite as directly provable anymore. So yeah. So I would land somewhere in there. It's funny, even though I make, I have criticisms of the Bible, and I have criticisms of Christian theology. The criticisms, honestly, are I'm not out there. Hopefully it doesn't come across. Some people are, let's just say, sensitive. Some people are like, oh, it's like you're an atheist now, and you're like going after Christianity, and I'm like, no, like these are some of the problems that like started to mount up, and I did. Again, there's research out there I didn't do. Obviously, I'm not saying my research was the end all be all, but I researched things for years and years and years and years, and I couldn't find solutions that stuck or they caused problems otherwhere, and so these are more of just like, hey, this is an apologetics issue, this is a biblical issue, this is a theological issue. We got to find, we got to find better solutions. Christians, you got to find better solutions for these. Otherwise, it doesn't quite make sense. And here's why. And here's some of the things. But I've commented. I've had people message me privately. I've had lots of people message me privately and actually say, hey, your journey really resonates and all that kind of stuff. And I'm a Christian, but I'm struggling with my faith. What should I do? Should I go down? Should I apostatize? And I'm like, unless you're already there, like unless you like, I knew when I was like beyond the point of no return, like unless you're there, if you want to stay, like go do the thing. Like here's some great scholarship on the Christian side. Like here's some really great pastors to go listen to. Here's some sermons on it. Like go talk to this person. Like if someone wants to stay a Christian and they're struggling with that, like go do that. Like I'm not one of those people that thinks like Christians are crazy or irrational or ruin everything or poison everything like that. It's not that at all. So still, like I said, still a big fan. Actually, most of the things I listen to are still Christians. Still post. It got a little misinterpreted, but still post. What it's that time of year for like really terrible History Channel and Discovery Channel shows about the Bible again. And some people are like, oh, like because it's about the resurrection. I'm like, no, because it's about like crazy, hyper skeptical fringe theories that are like nonsense. Like Jesus had like 7 kids, or like the Gnostics were part of the New Testament. That's still stupid stuff. So that's kind of where I'm at.
All right. Thanks, Tyler. Joe, can you give us kind of a rundown? I know you've spent a lot of time researching deconversion, and can you give us kind of where you're kind of at on things now. Where has your research reached? What kind of data do you have out there? And what are some of the kind of key things that you have noticed that are common across deconversions?
Sure. So I began my my PhD work in applied behavioral analysis, and in behavior analysis, it's kind of a stimulus and response approach to human behavior. So you would say that a thing occurs and then we respond to the thing by a behavior. And one of the things that's key in that is to see what sets you up for that behavior. So looking into that, as you know, my research approach was to look at high profile deconverts, people who had shared their stories across several different media. They'd written blog posts, they'd done interviews, they'd recorded YouTube videos and so forth. And so I could get the same story several times over by listening to them and reading them and so forth. Once I'd done that, I could pick out the thematic elements that were similar across the retellings of the stories and construct what we would call a phenomenological analysis of what it felt to them at the time. And so, this is where I got my data to form my model. And what I was looking at is what set them up for the behavior. So, for instance, eating a bag of chips would set you up for the behavior of drinking a glass of water, right? So, what would set somebody up for that? And I isolated it down to 5 main things in a religious environment that set somebody up for deconversion. And those were a sort of behavioral control environment where the religious environment rewarded you for behaving in a certain way and then punished you for behaving in another way. And this is through sort of disapproval versus approval. And the interesting thing is that you would become part of that approving and disapproving environment. So at the same time the environment's conditioning you, you're conditioning everybody else. You're participating in this group conditioning within the environment by, adding to the approval and disapproval for certain behaviors based around religion. So that was strongly linked to deconversion. And the way that set a person up for deconversion was that it's an uncomfortable environment. It's the kind of thing that you want to get out of. And if there's an alternative, if there's a route out, then you're going to feel much better once you remove yourself from that environment. So there's a relief that comes along with that. And I should say that this is generally a theme in deconversion in general, is that the overwhelming response to the deconversion is a sense of relief once you've left the religion. So there's that. And then another one was isolationism. So these Christian environments, which tend to put you in a bubble and say, hey, you can't go out and do this. You can't participate in certain activities. You can't talk to certain people. And isolationism comes in all flavors. You've got the pure cultic isolation where they're controlling who you can and cannot date and that kind of thing. And then you've got more generalized isolation where, maybe even it's because all of your friends and people you associate with are already part of the religion that you're unconsciously isolated from the outside environment. And the way that sets up for deconversion is that eventually you come in contact with things which are not Christian and have a surprising appeal to you. And you haven't built up any sort of kind of mechanism or Christianese response to these types of things. In the area of apologetics, what you'll find is that a lot of people get straw man versions of, say, the theory of evolution. This is what evolution says. This is why you shouldn't believe it. And then they actually come in contact with actual arguments from evolutionists and find that the steel man version is way more robust than the straw man version they've been fed all their lives. And then you can take that from evolution and just generalize it to any, secular kind of argument or ideals that you get fed through the pipeline of the church, and therefore receive only the strongman version and not the steelman version. So there's that isolationism. Spiritualism, where your religious environment kind of puts you in a condition where you think that the world is only superficially naturalistic and fundamentally spiritual, to the point that there's demons crouching behind every corner. This is the sort of Martin Luther approach that, all though this world with devil fills should threaten to undo us, kind of thing. Um, and so a lot of people who live in this environment where they believe that everything's a demon and, or divine intervention, as you have it, when they come in contact with the actual world, it seems less realistic. And then a science especially kind of draws them away from that idea, people who get involved with science. So that sets them up for the deconversion. But possibly the most startling finding for me, and probably the most profound finding, is this idea of what I call compulsory certainty, meaning that you're compelled to be, or you're sort of required to be by your environment, certain of your beliefs, such that uncertainty is the same thing as unfaithfulness. So, they substitute certainty for faith. And if you're uncertain, then that's doubt, and that's sort of a kind of spiritual weakness, such that when you have doubts, when you are uncertain about about things, you have to abandon them, because that's evidence against the truth of those things. And if I had one piece of advice to give to Christians in general, it would be more agnostic. Stop feeling like you have to be certain about your beliefs in order for those things, in order to remain Christian. It's possible to doubt. It's possible. I don't know is a perfectly acceptable response to questions that you have about your beliefs. It's okay to not know. You don't have to have all the answers. And, that would be my takeaway. That'd be the book that I would write in response to my research, is intellectual humility is really the piece that I would be pushing. Intellectual humility, meaning that I know my limitations. I know that there are holes in my knowledge, and that I don't have the mental capacity to know and comprehend everything.
Thank you, Joel. That's really interesting. I know we've had a number of conversations about this kind of in the past, and the kind of environments that tend to kind of contribute to this kind of thing. Tyler, what do you kind of make of that? Does any of that resonate with your experience?
Yeah, so it's funny. I was listening through, and Joel and I have talked about this. Not, we haven't talked so much as he's been deeper into his PhD. We talked originally, and one of the things that I constantly found when I was doing apologetics is that a lot of times, especially when you're dealing with someone that jumps ship like all the way to like full blown like Richard Dawkins atheism, is they're typically they're going from a fundamentalism to a fundamentalism. They're keeping fundamentalism at the core. They're just switching pants, right? It's just a different flavor of the same thing. It still is a very kind of myopic, us versus them, in group, out group, very high barrier to entry. Those type, very, very, very black and white, very like my side is at the, there's no evidence for the other side. My side, like it's just the obvious conclusion, right? It's that type of thing. And I think that, I think that would probably be the common thread of the things that Joel was talking about. That's kind of that environment that goes through all of them. What's interesting for I don't know if it's interesting for me listening to it, is like, I didn't resonate with any of them. With the exception of maybe the first one, but only with a caveat. And that is the pressure. So I felt a sense of relief at the end, but it wasn't from the group itself, right? So the pressure, it was almost like the pressure grew the closer and closer I got to deconversion, and more had to do with kind of the cognitive dissonance of remaining kind of closeted in this group. And the feeling of uncomfort of that, and finally being able to say finally be able to shed it, so to speak. But it's not a sense of freedom from the group itself, if that makes any sense. And so there is a little bit of feeling from that. And there is a sense of kind of freedom from that, but it's not so much the other ones. It wasn't my experience. And again, I don't know if it's the church background in the sense, and I've tried to make this distinction between kind of a capital F fundamentalism and a lowercase f fundamentalism, or I think I was a capital F fundamentalist. I held to the fundamentals of the faith. But I was never really, and I don't know if it's because I came from an atheistic background. I came from a very secular background. I never quite got into full church subculture. I also converted in California. So like a conservative in California is still kind of like a moderate, a little bit left of liberal when you're talking about the South. So that just wasn't, so like that lowercase f fundamental is kind of like you can be an atheistic fundamentalist, or you can be whatever fundamentalist. That lowercase f is kind of the cultural fundamentalism, the kind of subcultural fundamentalism. And I don't think that I ever was in that type of thing. I went to Moody Bible Institute, which had a lot of lowercase f's, fundamentalists in there. And even there, I felt, I was like, well, I mean, I would basically say what Joel would say and be like, hey, like, yeah, read scholars who disagree with you. Like read people who disagree with you. Like go have a beer with your neighbor and talk with them about their world. Like don't shun people who disagree. Like, so that was never quite my experience.
Okay. Could you speak to kind of what your environment was like a little bit, as much as you're comfortable sharing, just so we can kind of understand a little bit? Because I know me and Joel, when we've discussed this, a lot of the churches, and like you said, the common thread between a lot of these kind of things are all things that are very common within cults, but you have levels of everything. Churches are all kind of on a spectrum. You have ones that are very culty. You have ones that are somewhere in the middle. You have ones that are led with solid leadership that's spread out, and no one person is kind of directing.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
and to be fair, I mean, like I'm not going to name names because they're
right.
They're probably wonderful people, but there are some people that are like mainline, not mainline in the sense of like mainline churches, but like very popular, Christian apologists that are basically like, if you don't agree with young Earth creationism, you like, maybe you're a Christian, but like you are a stick snatched from the flames, like you're barely getting in. And it's only by the hair on your chin, singed at that. So, and they're big, very, it's part of the the SBC, or they're whatever. So, I'm hesitant to go along and say that it's cultish, although I understand the connection. I would say the things that Joel was talking about, really, I mean, you could go from one SBC church to another SBC church and find the exact same anti-intellectualism, the exact same in-group out-group, the exact same villainization of outsiders. Right? You could find, and I don't, by the way, I don't mean I'm not actually trying to undermine the biblical categories. Like I think that there is a very biblical way that you can say there are outsiders to the church without it being like, we don't associate with those like filthy outsiders. Like those people are basically like, they might as well be eating babies. Right. So so I'm not trying to say like all biblical Christianity, if you follow the Bible, is like in-group, out-group, and you're villainizing. That's not what I mean either. The background that I came from, I mean, I'm a Reformed Presbyterian. I came from the PCA, which again is about, it's not as varied as the SBC, but you have PCA churches that are about, King James only, only sing the Psalter, women wear the head coverings, all the way to, preachers in Hawaiian churches at mega churches. They're all within the same thing. It's just, you have kind of overall doctrinal adherence to something like the Westminster Standards or something along those lines. Some of them skirt the lines and get away, especially when you're dealing with ethical issues. There's a rise of kind of progressives within the PCA that are going towards like when you're talking about like human sexuality and things like that. which I was never a part of that. I was actually kind of more on the conservative moderate side within the PCA. But my church, like, we'd go have beers, and we wouldn't get drunk or anything. Like, it was not that type of thing, but it wasn't like a King James only, don't dance, smoke, or chew, or go with girls who do kind of environment. Definitely, I mean, a focus on conduct. I mean, that we're not going to be out there like getting drunk and all that kind of stuff. But it's not the type of environment where I think you're seeing a lot of those deconversions come from the fundamentalist side.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at with that.
Like my pastor and I, we could read Michael Heiser together and read it and discuss it. We could, I was fully free. I mean, for those who know, like, I wasn't a young earth creationist. I held to a polemical temple text view, kind of along a literary framework. And I was entirely free. I was an ordained PCA ruling elder, entirely free to write that view, to publish that view, to make podcasts on that view. It was not kind of a, that type of restricted view. So.
Okay, thank you. With that, one other thing I would like to kind of ask about that, and again, just share what you're comfortable with, Tyler, but community-wise, in terms of pre and post deconversion, how has community shaped and changed for you over the course of the last few months?
It's a really good question. I mean, towards the end, I mean, I had relocated, and so was really towards the end, like, kind of, I had found what my home church was, and had been attending that church, although, with work had been traveling quite a bit more, but had been, finding Bible studies and church groups and things like that, hanging out with kind of a core group of guys. So that was there. Following it, I mean, I didn't have like a shunning experience, right? I still hang out with that group of guys. I don't go to the church anymore. Obviously, I don't go to Bible study anymore. They would probably they would welcome me to come back. I mean, it was a pretty open and kind community. I mean, I would totally be welcome to come back. It's just, having deconverted and not believing it's not quite what I want to do with my own time. Although, again, and I get this question a lot online. It's like, well, why are you still interested? And I'm like, well, it's still the most fascinating time. I still love the Bible. I still like talking about theology. I still like talking, all that kind of stuff. So the kind of shunning feeling, and I Caleb, you've like jumped in and chimed in sometimes, and I know, Joel, you've seen it a little bit too. The shunning came from like online people who didn't really know me that well, which was interesting, right? Because the people who knew me well, I had been talking to about, my doubts and my deconversion for the past, year and a half or whatever. They know what I was going. They know what I was thinking. They know the arguments I was going through. Not argue like fight arguments. The arguments against and for and against Christianity. They knew the scholarship that I was reading. I was doing research projects to try to shore up some of these things. Like that. There's a lot of that was happening. The ones who are like, oh well, you're doing it for like emotional reasons, and you hate Christians now, and all that kind of, like, there are people I'm like, I think I've talked to you maybe once online, so, or because I was I'm not like claiming I was like famous or anything, but like, because one of the things I was known for was also defensive Reformed theology and Calvinism, the kind of axe grinding anti-Calvinists would then jump on it and be like, oh, it was your Calvinism that did you in. And I'm like, well, actually Calvinism had next to nothing to do with, like, literally next to nothing to do with my deconversion. It actually had to do with biblical views of the nature of God, and some other things having to do with like inerrancy and inspiration and things like that. So, divine hiddenness and some other things. Calvinism had nothing to do with it. And so, I in one of my episodes, I came out and said, it's interesting. It's kind of like watching the Amazon version of a book when you really love, the book really well. Like, I'm watching these other people tell my story, And it's not really my story. It's a story, and I'm involved, and there's some touch points, but it's not my story. Because now it becomes like all about, well, Calvinism does this and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, I mean, grind your axe, do what you're going to do. And by the way, when I say anti-Calvinist, I don't mean all non-Calvinists, right? There are wonderful non-Calvinists that don't do this type of thing either. So, but it's that kind of like, very, very kind of hostile, anti-Calvinists that do it. So those types of responses and reactions have been interesting, kind of expected, but interesting nonetheless. So, but I have to say, I mean, I know a lot of people who come out of the faith and they're like, they feel like they got like shunned and ostracized and all that kind of stuff. And I want to be like, I mean, I got a bunch of those comments, but like 80 to 90% of the Christians that I talk to are wonderful to talk to. I mean, yes, they do. I don't mind when people, a lot of atheists, well, I'm not an atheist, a lot of converts are like, it's so condescending when people say like, I'll pray for you, or I hope you come back, Jesus still loves you. And they like take it as condescending. And I'm like, I mean, I appreciate it. Or like where they say, oh, well, then you were never a Christian. I'm like, I entirely understand that theologically consistently that's the metaphysics that works within that system of theology. Like I don't take any of that as like condescending or negative. Like I understand that it's generally meant from like if they'll pray for me, I think both of you have said you wanted to pray. Like, pray for me. Go. Like, please. I appreciate the heartfelt sentiment. So most of my interactions have actually been positive. So I have an experience. I think some of the negativity, like broad scale negativity, and being cut off from a very like family feeling community and being shunned type of feeling that possibly a lot of the people in Joel's study had to endure. So, yeah.
Okay. Joel, I'm going to kind of throw this back at you and see what kind of your thoughts are at this point. And Dale, if you want to jump in at any point as well, please feel free to jump in with any questions or thoughts you may have as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I have a couple questions, but I'll let Joel go answer first, and then I'll come back with a couple questions.
Sounds good.
Okay, so most deconversion researchers that I've read have really tackled the question of what causes a person to leave the church or say that they're not Christian, which is, that's deconversion. It's what Tyler's gone through. My deconversion question, or my research question, has been very specifically what causes a person to stop being a Christian and start identifying as an atheist, which is not what Tyler has gone through. So when I speak to the research, it would only apply to my specific research question. It wouldn't apply to Tyler, but I've read enough of the research to be able to speak somewhat to Tyler's position. And he's had mentioned something about the relief that he felt having more to do with, the release of the cognitive dissonance and, and no longer holding to an identity that wasn't his and things like that. And I would say that's probably symptomatic of most of the relief feeling that you get from deconverts. I wasn't trying to represent all of the relief coming just from, the pressures to behave that you get from the religious environment. And there have been studies that suggest that atheists, and again, this is my field of research. I'm not saying Tyler is an atheist, but feeling that when they used to be Christian and they now consider themselves atheists, there's this feeling of being in the closet, and that they feel like it's kind of a coming out of the closet experience, directly similar to the sort of homosexual experience of coming out of the closet. And in fact, there are studies, Caleb, you and I actually discussed a study the American Atheist Society put out where they were talking about how atheists are marginalized and, it feels like sort of an oppression in society. And again, comparing themselves with sort of marginalized communities like that. So my whole point in bringing that up is that Tyler had said that he felt relief, but it wasn't because his church environment was forcing him to behave. And no, his experience is actually very similar in that he's now true to his identity versus trying to kind of hide it or, deal with the cognitive dissonance, which is basically having problems with your faith, but holding on to your faith. Those two things are in tension, and that's what's causing the discomfort that we call cognitive dissonance. Once you get rid of one of those two things that conflict, there's no longer that cognitive dissonance, and of course, relief comes with that. So there's that. One of the interesting things about Tyler's case is that he represents what, and Caleb, you may be familiar with this, an ABA form of study, of experimental study. He would be considered pseudo-experimental because I didn't go in and manipulate any of the circumstances to see if I could get the result of deconversion. But when I say ABA, that means that, if you want to find out what would cause a person to, in this case, convert, you would introduce the, thing, see if they converted, and then remove the thing and see if they would go ahead and deconvert. That's ABA. A being introducing the experimental stimulus, seeing if you get the response. B being removing it, and then seeing if you get the reverse response. So the fact that Tyler actually came from sort of a non-theistic, sort of secular background and converted to Christianity, which was part of, one of his draws when he was doing apologetics, was, hey, I used to be an atheist, kind of thing. And then he deconverted. So he went sort of atheist, theist, and then deconvert to whatever it is he is now. A nun.
Whatever that soup is. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I hesitate to jump in and psychoanalyze Tyler because that's not my job, and I don't have the enough data to do so. But it would seem to me that he had said that the reason that he converted was because of his sort of philosophical studies he had done. He'd looked into the philosophy and he'd found that, Christianity kind of filled in some of these philosophical holes which were not answered otherwise. Tyler was a presuppositionalist.
If I could add one point there. So there's a step in my conversion that I think you're missing. So I went from atheist to theist to Christian. And I did have a religious experience.
Okay.
That was one of the things that made the jump for me.
Okay.
There was other things having to do with kind of a minimal facts approach to the resurrection and some of those things I looked at. But there was a religious experience after a church service. That was one of the things that actually pushed me for it was the final straw that moved me from theism to Christianity.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I could talk about that too, because in the conversion studies from atheists, they say that, in the researchers have shown that the first step is to remove the sort of intellectual objections, introduce them to Christians so that they kind of discard these negative stereotypes that they have about Christians. And then there's almost always sort of a spiritual experience, which becomes the kind of catalyst that moves them directly into the Christianity piece. But, at this point, Tyler remains a theist of some sort, but not Christian, which would indicate to me that whatever he has hold of now is enough to answer the philosophical questions he would otherwise have if he were not a theist, without the Christian piece being involved. So
yeah, that's accurate.
He's got the piece that he needs in order to not be atheist, but he doesn't also need the Christianity kind of smeared on top of that.
Yeah, and I think if I can add, and this is probably where Dale has questions, or I don't know if
you guys just stole two of my questions. I was going to ask you about your conversion.
Yeah, I think I think it's not only that it's not just kind of a Laplacian, I have no need of that theory, although it is somewhat that. It's also somewhat of, and I gave this example before of like, if my house kept burning down, and the fire kept starting in the refrigerator, I'd eventually just get rid of the refrigerator. And one of the things that I found is that theism was a nice, tidy thing that kind of answered a bunch of the questions. And every time there was a problem, it seemed to come from the Christian refrigerator. And so there was a certain point where that became in and of itself became a problem because I couldn't find the resources within Christianity to kind of stop the fires from continuing to happen, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, okay. So I think my first question, I'll start with Tyler. I think you kind of answered it. The first thing I wanted to do is, look, we're doing the show on deconversion. Well, I think perhaps understanding your conversion and why did you convert in the first place would have been helpful. You've kind of already answered that. Is there anything else about your conversion that you think would be important for?
It's probably important to understand the kind of the trajectory. I don't know how important understanding all of this is to talking about it, but I had an atheistic philosophy professor, right? I was majoring in philosophy, and I was an atheist and I was a naturalist. I wasn't like an anti-theist. I wasn't like I was never like super hostile. I just didn't believe it. I just grew up secular. It wasn't a thing. Like I tell people the story, like when I first became a Christian, my very first Christmas, I was like, oh, that's what all those Christmas carols about. Like I literally didn't know before. So I wasn't like antithetical to it. But I had an atheistic philosophy professor, and in my course on metaphysics, the first section of that is on arguments for the existence of God, and he went through the contingency arguments. He went through the moral argument, which is one of the ones that did it for me. He went through a bunch of these arguments, and he gave what are the best philosophical rebuttals to them. But there was a couple of times where he's like, look, like these are really hard challenges. And, this is he seemed like he was almost convinced by the moral argument too. The moral argument was the one that convinced me basically that naturalism is false. That kind of metaphysical naturalism is false, and that some type of theism is true, and that kicked off the ball rolling. And so throughout my entire Christian life, I always kind of came back to that philosophical grounding of God as the ground of being, God as the necessary precondition. It's why I think I naturally went into a presuppositionalist position, and I probably am somewhat of a presuppositionalist classical theist, because I still think that God is the necessary precondition for rationality. Because apart from that, I don't know how you get anything like the laws of logic or anything like that. So, or how you get intentionality, or how you get minds, or how you get persons. Like I'm still there. It's just that I don't see how any part of Christianity. So there's kind of a Mott and Bailey that happens where a lot of presuppositionalists will make the argument, they'll appeal to God as the ground of being. But all of the resources that you need in classical theism to make God the ground of being just are attributes that are present in classical theism. There's nothing specifically Christian that gets you there, except maybe the one of the many, although I just found that one as time went on, I just found it to be very unconvincing. So there was nothing specifically Christian that grounded that for me. So when there started to be tension between biblical views of God and classical theism, which is really one of the things that drove me away, all of the things that I needed my theistic worldview to stay were firmly grounded in theism. And again, all the fires kept coming from the Christian refrigerator. Like it didn't seem to add anything. It kept adding. It added things, but it seemed to be the source of where all of the leaks were, so to speak.
Gotcha. Okay. So Joel, just kind of following up, obviously you've been doing your research and you've kind of identified these 5 factors or indicators. And if I've understood though, I don't think I got them all, but the ones I got, it's kind of a lot focused towards the end, right? They have these traits and then they're exposed to something. So you're focusing on the deconversion part, but have you found in your studies that the way people convert in the first place plays any role in the deconversions at all? Or
I should have mentioned that when I was doing the ABA thing with about Tyler, because almost exclusively people who move from Christianity to atheism versus other kinds of deconversion are people who were raised in the church and never had a proper conversion experience. And that's why Tyler is a unique situation, because although he has not moved to atheism, he was not raised in the church. He wasn't Christian by default. He didn't absorb Christianity by osmosis. He actually put some thought into it, and he had what would be considered more of a classical conversion experience, and a classical conversion experience on a sort of the current psychological model of religious conversion would be that you have some kind of discontent or problem in your life. You enter what's called a seeker mode, where you're looking for solutions or resolutions for the difficulty. And you come across, in this case, Christianity as a possible solution to your problem. And then, the rest of those stages involve getting involved in the community, practicing with other Christians, and then eventually making some kind of statement of faith to the community, revealing that you identify as part of that community. So yeah, I mean, what it boils down, the answer to your question is that usually deconverts are people who are raised in the church and are Christian by default.
Is that why, if I can ask like just out of my curiosity, is that why a lot of times you find like atheists? I always found it was interesting. Atheists are like, oh, you're indoctrinated as children, and it's based on the evidence. But then their deconversion is like, I was 13 years old when I came to believe in atheism, right? Like I'm always like, okay, like are you're most rational at 13 years old? Is that why? That tends to be like in that kind of teen years that we see a lot of those moves from Christianity to atheism.
Well, it happens during the teenage years for a number of reasons, all of which would be fairly obvious to anybody who's ever had a teenager. It's a period of time in life when, well, I mean, if you want to get technical, it boils down to brain development.
Yeah.
During the teenage years, the areas of your brain are developing, and the area that develops the least quickly is the one that involves sort of impulse control and emotional control. And so you're more impulsive, you're more liable to take risks and make large sort of, I don't know, commitments that you wouldn't otherwise make if you were a rational human being. But no, and in addition to that, there's a search for identity that occurs in adolescence, and you really are trying to nail down who you are as a person, and you're kind of flailing around to grab onto anything that you can. Certain studies have suggested that if you are a Christian and you're tempted to deconvert, you have a sort of risk reward thing that you have to weigh out. And in the study that I read about this, the risk was, I think they called it existential emptiness or something like that. Basically, you're losing the sort of existential fulfillment that is offered by religion. But the reward is that your peers tend to favor and praise anybody who challenges authority structures. And since the dominant authority structure is, in this case, religion or the church, you're being sort of an edgy, angsty teenager who's challenging the church and asking these questions like, yeah, well, who created God, kind of thing. Yeah. Get you.
And you're challenging the authority of your parents who are foisting this identity upon you. Ostensibly foisting it, upon you.
Right. And speaking to your piece about the indoctrination thing, one of the key stages of deconversion is forming a deconversion narrative, which is the sort of reverse, photo negative of a Christian testimony, which is, I'm a Christian now. The Christian testimony is, I'm a Christian now. I have to look back across my entire life, including the times that I wasn't a Christian, and reinterpret those through the lens of my current belief system. So now, all of those times that I wasn't a Christian and this bad thing, this happened, and this other bad thing happened, that was God moving in my life to kind of get me to where I am now. But when you deconvert, you have to look back across your Christian experience, and especially things like your religious experience that you had after the service there. That had an explanatory factor when you were a Christian that it no longer has when you are no longer a Christian. And so you have to look back across your history as a religious person and re-explain how it is that you've believed these things you now find unbelievable, and what caused these experiences that you once thought were religious to occur. And so you then go back and re-identify things, and the most common sort of identifier that you put on why you had those beliefs in the first place, if you were raised in the church, is that you were brainwashed. It was this cult, and they took you in, and they, indoctrinated you, and that's why you believe those things, because you'd never have believed those things otherwise.
That's really interesting, actually. So that piece, I actually, your 5 criteria, I was like, not so much. That one actually, there is a sense where, I mean, I'm not trying to look back and be like, oh, I was brainwashed. I mean, I was an adult. I voluntarily chose. I wasn't, raised in any certain way. It's always why when atheists are like, oh, you were brainwashed, I was like, really? Who brainwashed me when I was 20 years old in my philosophy program? But that one does resonate, because there is this sense coming out of it where it's like, okay, like, especially, for those of us who want to be more self-reflective and kind of understand, there is a sense where it's like, okay, what do I do with all that? And there's sometimes this question comes up, people are like, oh, well, Tyler just wants attention, that's why he keeps talking about it. I'm like, no, it's a sense of like, you've gone through this journey and now you want to just talk with people about this journey, because there's a processing element to that, and understanding. And I've realized actually through this, for me, when I first started talking about it, it was easier for me to conceptualize from the last thing that happened going backwards. But I realized in telling people, and Joel, I think I talked to you about this, if I remember right, in one of our PMs, what I found interesting was, if I start at the very end, which the way my deconversion happened is actually where emotion finally kicked in, was at the very, very end. But if I start there, the narrative, and understandably, is seen as, there was this emotional thing that happened, and then the deconversion happened, because I'm starting what makes sense to me from why I came out and working backwards. And so I found, actually, in telling the story, I can't tell it that way. That can't be how I present the narrative, because it just presents it wrong. It talks about it wrong. It conveys it wrong, and it kind of scratches the wrong itch for people who might be going through similar experiences. And so it's better to actually kind of start at the beginning, where the intellectual erosion started happening, long way before any type of even thought of deconversion happened. And then only at the very tail end is where things like hiddenness and doubting the love of God and all that kind of stuff came in. That was like the very last thing, after I had actually lost my belief, and I was only holding on by this volitional faith, kind of a Pascalian faith. Where else shall I go? You have the words of life, but like, I didn't actually have the intellectual side of it anymore. And so that's where the emotion kicked in. And I finally was like, I don't even have the wherewithal to remain by faith anymore. So it's very interesting when you talk about like kind of the need for the narrative. That actually is something that I do very much resonate in as part of this deconversion experience.
So what you're talking about, and I didn't address this, there's more to my model than just identifying those 5 features of a religious background. There is, you could ask any religious person this, have you ever had any doubts or any kind of challenges or anything? And everybody has, it's just part of being. It's the human condition that any belief system you have is going to run up against challenges every once in a while. And so what happens with most people is that they see the challenge. They're like, I don't know what the answer, that's not huge. Let's just move past that. But these things continue to build. You continue to have all these unresolved challenges that you don't think about it, and you don't really do much about at that time. And then there is a period, well, let me put it this way. There's a thing that I call the prohibitive principle. And the prohibitive principle is that which keeps you from asking those questions, keeps you from actually looking at all those challenges and questions and addressing them and wrestling with them. And the prohibitive principle is different for different people. In the case of an intellectual, the prohibitive principle might be sort of a sense of confidence that, I have all the answers, or there are answers out there if I look for them, kind of thing. Or it, in a lot of people's case, it's a sense of loyalty. I don't want to ask those questions because I don't want to seem disloyal to God or to the church or whatever. Sometimes it's fear. I really don't want to ask those questions because that would be sin or something like that. But whatever it is, there's something that's keeping you from addressing those questions. And then an event occurs in your life, or a series of events, something that removes that prohibitive principle. So, again, with sort of the sense of loyalty. You've heard the trope of somebody moving off to college and then becoming an atheist. Once you remove yourself from that Christian environment, there's no longer a community to which you feel the compelled to be loyal. And you go to college and you have a bunch of friends who aren't Christians, and suddenly, you're free to ask those questions. You're giving yourself intellectual permission to struggle with those questions. And so at some point in your life, it's possible you may find that there was a triggering event or a series of events which allowed you to really dig up all of these things that you had questions about that you couldn't answer, or that the answer seemed to be not Christianity kind of thing. But you didn't ask those questions, or you didn't seriously wrestle with them until after this event or series of events.
All right. So I just have a couple last questions. Obviously, I know we're limited on time. I want to make sure Tyler and Joel have as much time to interact. So, Joel, I'll start with you first this time. And it kind of piggybacks off a little bit about what you're saying about this, prohibitive principle. You can't ask questions, stuff like that. And one of your indicators was what you called this compulsory certainty. And I just wanted you to clarify things there, because that might be confusing. So in the first place, I think a lot of times, we want to look intellectual, so we say, yeah, it's okay to doubt, and you should be asking all these questions, and that's all correct. But I think that the end goal is certainty. If we can get it, like I have certainty that 1 + 1 = 2, that's good. That's awesome. If I could get certainty for as many beliefs as possible, but it's what we're looking for is you have to be warranted in having that certainty. And I think that's where the problem comes in. People think they're warranted and certain about beliefs that they aren't. So is there a distinction between having certainty versus this compulsory certainty that you think one is okay, the other's not?
Well, from my personal perspective, I advocate for what I've already talked about, intellectual humility. And intellectual humility is this idea that, I recognize that there is no way that I could ever know enough to know everything. There's always more to know. There's more to grow. Life is a learning event, and I can always hear new perspectives and change my mind, and recognize that there's a good chance I will never be settled on any particular thing, with the certainty that there's no challenge out there that could possibly sway my mind or prove me wrong. And intellectual humility is not sort of a resignation. It's a dynamic situation in which you never settle in a position and say, this is my position. I will never move from this position, because there's more to know, and I am a limited human being. I can't be certain to that degree. Now, to bring a little bit more into this, there's two techniques that are very effective in persuading people that they're wrong about things. And these are rhetorical techniques or argument techniques that have been come up with. One is Peter Boghossian's street epistemology. And street epistemology circles or centers around certainty. They'll come up and, ask you to make a claim. Well, God exists. Well, on a scale of 1 to 10, how certain are you that God exists? Well, if you give anything less than a 10, they'll be like, so you're a little uncertain. Let's talk about that. Why aren't you a 10? Why are you a 9? And then you start explaining why you can't be certain about this, and you end up talking yourself out of the position. And street epistemology has become a cottage industry, really. There are people who are making their living off of doing live streams of grabbing people in the streets and doing street epistemology about everything from aliens to Trump to, maybe God occasionally, whatever. They just talk people out of their positions. Street epistemology is very effective about talking people out of a position, not great at talking anybody into a position. For that, there's another technique called deep canvassing. And this has been developed by the political left as sort of a campaigning technique to talk people into specific sort of progressive points, like decreasing military budget, or sort of pro-life. I'm sorry, not pro-life. What's the other one? Pro-choice. Yeah. So that kind of thing. And this one centers more around narrative. So they'll come up and they'll ask, all right, what's your position on this? You tell them that. All right, well, tell me more about that. Okay, this is why I hold this position. Okay. Have you ever had a contact with a woman who had to have an abortion? Well, I knew this one person. All right, tell me about her. Well, she was okay. And then maybe they'll share a little bit about a story of somebody they knew. And as you become emotionally involved in the story, because deep canvassing is really about story. Um, as you become emotionally involved in the story, your certainty tends to move less and less for your specific position, and you change your mind over time. So both of those techniques really focus on certainty, because certainty is really difficult for anybody to hold on a position, in real life.
Thank you so much for that. That was,
and maybe if I could qualify, because Joel, I think if I understand you, I think you actually left something out of your explanation. The compulsory part of it, which is that part of what leads it to the deconversion, isn't just that you have this sense of certainty. It's almost that your community that you're in requires you to have this sense of certainty, or else you're viewed as a doubt, or it kind of has this community pressure to keep you from expressing your doubts. Otherwise, you'll get some type of like negative reinforcement or looked down upon, or something along those lines. Right? That's the compulsory component of it, right?
Absolutely. And, again, because those 5 things were more about the religious environment than the individual within that environment, then yes, the environment itself compels you to be certain. And if you express uncertainty about something, then that's kind of a spiritual weakness. If you went to heaven today, or if you died today, are you sure that you would wake up at the gates of heaven? Well, maybe not entirely. You need to be 100% sure that you would go to heaven right now if you died today, kind of thing. That's classic evangelism. Or, you're not certain of the word of God. You're not standing with firmness on the rock of your foundation. There's this certainty is kind of baked into the language of Christianity, to the point that, if you feel uncertain, you feel compelled to kind of hide it and, downplay it or pretend that you're not uncertain, because that would be discouraged by your religious environment.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll just say thank you for throwing that in, Tyler, because you said it much better than me. That's what I was trying to get with that qualifier about the compulsory element kind of thing. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, and part of what that does, I mean, if I could add some nuance, this is just from my experience. I don't know if Joel's research actually hashed this out, but I've seen this, is where what happens is because of the community you're in, you've either come to be convinced of your certainty, or you kind of have this like guilt association that you're not certain, that you hide it, so that becomes part of what becomes part of what it means to be a Christian for you. So when you start to have doubts, about, for example, you have to have certainty that young earth creationism is true. If you don't have certainty, well, then you're going along with like atheistic secular science, and you hate the Bible and all that kind of stuff. So if you even start to have a doubt about that, why even be a Christian at that point anymore, right? Because now you don't have certainty about this kind of what probably all of us on this call, even when I was a Christian, would understand as kind of a secondary, or not a non-essential, even though it may be very important, a non-essential. That becomes like a key thing for the identity to be a Christian, such that if there's any doubt there, then the entire system is in doubt. You can't have anything less than certainty on anything that's seen as vital.
Yeah, there's another piece to that as well, and you'll see this. Interestingly, a large number of the deconversions that I study come from either Pentecostal or from Catholic sort of backgrounds. And from the Pentecostal end, especially, you'll see these stories about, well, I was just kind of trying to speak in tongues and doing my best and pretending, kind of thing. And then I looked around and I realized that's probably what everybody else is doing too. And so there's this kind of if me, then them feeling, where if I'm feeling all of these doubts and I'm trying to hide that to fit in with the environment, then maybe everybody else is as well, kind of thing. So you sort of generalize your experience to everyone around you, and that makes the whole system look a lot faker.
All right, awesome. So last question for me, because I'm sure Tyler and Joel are getting sick of me, but
no, it's great.
Awesome. So Tyler, one thing I want to ask you about is because I have listened to some of your reasons and that sort of thing, and it's kind of we've talked about not having this certainty, compulsory certainty, and stuff like that. Now, on your end, I've heard you give some reasons where you think Christianity or the Christian God is logically absurd or reductio ad absurdum. So, is there any room? Are you absolutely certain that Christianity's false? Is it plausible that you could be wrong in any way? Like, where do you stand on that front?
Oh yeah, it's entirely plausible that I could be wrong, right? I mean, one of the reasons why I keep presenting the arguments is because I'm at the point where I don't think that I'll return, but like if someone could convince me again, great. I'm not. Again, I don't think like Christians are like out of their minds or anything like that. That'd be great. And I don't think that. So I don't think that just because an argument can present a contradiction, that therefore the argument is necessarily sound, right? So it could be the case that there's an argument that demonstrates that there's some type of contradiction, but there could be a rejoinder that comes along and says, oh well, no, there's this nuance that's between the parallel conceptions that you have, such that there actually is a subtle equivocation that's happening that you're not quite thinking of, right? So even though I think the more and more I'm from an outsider again and looking at and making objections, that the more and more I see and all that kind of stuff, it'd be harder. It's getting harder and harder, I think, for someone to be able to win me back over. But it doesn't mean, and I was never here when I was a Christian. It doesn't mean that I think that just because I think that I have a good argument or a sound argument, that I have absolute like Cartesian certainty of it, or anything along those lines. I think if I had Cartesian, like, there's a reason why, I wouldn't debate someone who was like, oh, 2 + 2 is 7, or there's married bachelors. I'd be like, why would I waste time on that? So, there's not certainty, but there is a growing level of confidence that Yahweh is the biblical, the biblical concept of God and the biblical narrative are not let's just call it true to life. Well, and I should caveat that, because there's a certain sense where, like I said at the beginning, like I love the Bible. There's a certain sense where I think it's a beautiful book. I think it's true to life on all kinds of things. In the same way, I think a lot of religious writings are true to life in the sense that they're expressions of the deep human experience and those types of things. So I won't ever be one of those people that's like, oh, the Bible is false and fairy tales. Well, that just shows that you're just not taking what the Bible even is. Even if you don't think it's like the inspired word of God, you're still just not even taking what the literature is seriously at that point. So I don't want people to hear when I say, like, I don't think it's true, that therefore, oh well, are you saying that this piece isn't true and this piece is, like, no, that's not what I'm saying.
Interesting. Yeah, I wanted to ask that because it's kind of similar to my own journey. Like when I left the faith, on myself kind of thing. I kind of assessed religions in terms of positive and negative evidences. So, negative evidences are some of the things you mentioned. I had as high 95%. I actually assigned numbers that I was convinced Christianity was false given those factors, but the positive evidences were able to overwhelm it. So I just kind of wanted to throw that as a possibility. Maybe the positive evidences could overwhelm the negative doubts that you have and stuff like that.
It could, and to be fair, I mean that's sort of what happened in my deconversion, right? So I've said pretty, unequivocally, there's no like silver bullet for why I think Christianity is no longer true, or no longer think Christianity is true, I should say. It just became it was effectively, I'm kind of a cumulative casus now. It's just kind of a cumulative case. It was just this building and building and building and building and building of lines of reasons and arguments and invitations and arguments here and arguments there and this problem here and this problem. It just became, it's kind of like problem of a heap. At what point is a heap a heap? Well, I don't know how many marbles have to be there for it to be a heap of marbles, but I know a heap when I see a heap. And it got to a point where it was like, this is a heap. This now is the negative evidence now does outweigh the positive evidence. And it kept growing and growing and growing to the point where even the positive evidence, I started saying, okay, I'm not even sure that makes sense. So it started even eroding some of the positive evidences that were there.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. Caleb, I'll just come in at the end. I see we have one audience question, but yeah, I'll let you, I know you have your plan, so I'll let you finish it off.
Yeah. So we'll actually go ahead and kind of dive in on this question. And I want Joel to kind of answer it as well. I'm going to rephrase it just a little bit. I don't know if I can throw that question up there, Dale. Can you? There we go. So in regards into looking at deconversion in general, as well as your experience, Tyler, what apologetics were not effective? Which ones still have you ruminating and thinking, okay, if which are the strongest, which are kind of the weakest?
Yeah.
From your view.
Yeah. So it's a very good question. I think one of the things that I found, and I mentioned this before about like the transcendental argument, is that I found there's not a lot. There's actually not a lot of apologetics for Christianity. There's a lot of apologetics for theism. But when I started going through and I started thinking like, okay, well, what are specifically the apologetics arguments that lead to Christian theism outside of kind of the minimal and maximal cases for the resurrection? I really can't think of many, right? I can think of argumentation. I can think of apologetics that is negative, right? That tries to overcome objections to the Bible. It tries to overcome objections to Christian theism. But there's not a lot of positive apologetics for Christian theism, right? It gets you to there's dozens and dozens and dozens, more effective, less effective. Some I think are bad. Some I think are, better for something like the existence of a transcendental creator of all reality, something like what we call God. And so there's not a lot of Christian apologetics, to be frank. And I think that's part of it. And what I found was the Christian apologetics became, it just started becoming looking more and more ad hoc in a lot of ways. Defenses for the Bible, and Bible contradictions. And I don't mean that there aren't great defenses for, like, every time someone says, oh, well, the Bible's false because bats are birds. Like, I still roll my eyes like about as far back as they can go when people say things like that. But there are substantive problems that I think any Christian, let me put it this way, any Christian who isn't a progressive that basically just wants to throw inerrancy out the window, if you want to be an inerrantist, which I think if you're going to be a Christian is like the way that it's worth it. If you want to be that, you have to take some of these things very, very seriously. And I found a lot of the responses were good. The other one that I didn't find very good, this is actually still a problem for theism generally also. So, but it's just more pointed, I think, for Christianity is the problem of hiddenness and the, evil, suffering, and divine hiddenness. Because there are all kinds of problems. And I think the answers given are really poor. They're just outside of falling back on just a hard creator-creature distinction. God can do whatever he wants. That's probably the most satisfying one, to be honest. All the other ones, soul building, sainthood, free will, all those ones, they're not good actually at answering, I think, the problem of hiddenness in a robust sense. On the flip side, the arguments that I'm like, oh, that I still think it's a good argument, and there are ways out, but it's like it's harder. I actually do think the minimal facts argument for the resurrection is probably I've become less and less convinced of it, and I think that I'm starting to see more and more rejoinders to it and all that kind of stuff. But that's the one that I'm still like, oh yeah, but like, what about this? And what, like, that is one of the ones that is still a challenge, which is in the Christian favor because the resurrection is the central claim of Christianity. So if that, to me, I think that still is the strongest claim, which is good because it's actually an argument about the strongest claim of Christianity. So,
I think that's a really, really good point, Tyler. And it's something I've seen in Christian apologetics as well, is we don't focus nearly enough on the person and character of Christ and the evidence that surrounds that case. Because I'm actually not a huge fan of the minimal facts, but I think there are more facts out there that can logically be included in that argument to make it stronger. So,
are you like a maximal facts, like a Lydia McGrew type of, like, towards that realm?
Yeah, I lean more that way.
I've started to I've started to read more on that one. I still think the minimal facts is stronger, but I can see why I go that way. But I have stronger objections, I think, to the maximal case than the minimal. But that family of arguments, I think, is still the best thing that Christian apologetics probably has going for it.
Well, in that same kind of note, what's your take on the Shroud of Turin?
I mean, I haven't studied it that much, to be honest. So I'll leave it at that, because I have opinions and views on it. I've watched a couple like YouTube debates and stuff like that. It hasn't been enough research to really delve into it, but from what I've seen, it's been enough that I'm like, I'm not going to take it that seriously. So there are other things that are going to take up my research time than that. So, but if someone's like, oh, here's like a really good, solid reason why, that's convincing, then maybe I'd rethink about it again.
But maybe Joel should answer that too, just so we're being fair as well.
I was exactly going to do that. So, Joel, in your research, I'm going to kind of rephrase to be more in line with what you've been talking about. Within apologetics, what have you seen that people have called out as being ineffective? What have you seen that has been more effective? What are your thoughts on this whole last few minutes?
So the thing about deconversion is that oftentimes it's a binary choice that the person's religious environment puts in front of them. And frequently, very frequently, the binary choice is either you believe that the Bible is entirely true in a literal sense, or you're not a Christian. And when that's the binary placed in front of you, and you have any kind of Bible problem, then the only other choice the church has given you is to see yourself to the exit. And so a lot of apologetics in those cases are focused around running around and plugging holes in the Bible, trying to be the little Dutch boy to keep the dam from collapsing by sticking your fingers in all the holes. And apologetics just seems like kind of a desperate attempt to shore up what seems like a very flimsy dam at that point, because Bible problems are by far the number one objection that people give, which has led to their deconversion, is problems with the Bible. And, circling back to Tyler's perspective here, you could chuck the Bible out the window literally, and you don't necessarily get rid of God. It seems illogical to me to say the Bible is false, therefore there is no God. That's just, illogical. But, if the Bible is false, then you could easily make the argument that there is no Christianity. And so, but creationism is another one. That's a huge thing, because frequently a person's religious environment has said either you believe in creationism or you're not a Christian. And when creationism, there are many people that you will run into, many Christians, heck, and non-Christians for that case, that think apologetics is all about arguing for creationism. And as a result, when creationism seems kind of flimsy, after a person goes off to college, for instance, and gets a steel man of evolution or what have you, then it seems like the challenge is put in front of them that they probably aren't a Christian because they no longer believe in a 7-day literal creation, 10,000 years ago or whatever. And so, those are the things which really speak about apologetics. Apologetics for many is you have to either believe the Bible, and so apologetics is all about trying to patch up holes in the Bible, or you have to believe in creationism specifically, and apologetics is defending a literal 7-day creation 10,000 years ago or 6,000, however.
All right, awesome. So I think we've kind of reached the end. And to kind of close us out, the main host of Faith Unaltered has arrived, David Russell. Let's bring him in. Hey, David, how's it going?
Hey guys, how you doing? It's good to see all of you here.
Hey, hey.
I wanted to say before you guys started, like, I heard the original cast of the Mentionables, like when you guys were about to start it off, and it actually ushered me into wanting to do this type of stuff more and have these type of conversations more. So I just want to thank you guys for that. And, Joel, Caleb, and Tyler, I mean, all you guys, really impacted my faith in the fact that I wanted to get the truth out there and pursue the truth and have these type of conversations, so thank you for that. But yeah, it's been a wild month, and I want to thank everybody. Dale, you did a phenomenal job, helping me and Tyler and Caleb. Thank you for being there and helping us out as well. But yeah, I just wanted to come in and at least say that we're on our way back, and you're going to get a lot more content as as we produce it. But the team is growing and the conversations are growing, and I thank you guys for the night, or at least for tonight, or tomorrow if you're on the East Coast. But yeah, so Dale, I'll let you tell everybody, and you and Caleb tell everybody good night, and I'll just run the tech from there.
Okay, all right, cool. Well, yeah, as David said, I think this has been a great show. Thank you so much to Joel and Tyler for coming on and giving their perspective on this important concept. Why do people deconvert? What do we make of that as Christians? How do we respond to that and that sort of thing and understand that? So this has been a great conversation. I've learned a lot from both the guests and stuff, and I want to say thank you so much to Caleb because he's the one who put this together. He made it happen. So yeah, over to you, Caleb, if you have any closing words.
Yeah, thank you all for participating tonight. Thank you, Dale, for being here with me. And Joel and Tyler, thank you guys for coming on and having such an open, honest, challenging conversation on this topic. I really appreciate you guys being the open books you've been tonight and having this talk with us. I hope that we can have some more of these as well down the road. So thank you guys so much. Do y'all want to give a quick shout out for where people can listen to more of your content? Joel, you want to go first?
Sure. So currently, we've talked about the Mentionables a couple of times in this podcast. The Mentionables are sort of on a hiatus, if anything else, at this time. And my focus has really been on the material for switching sides. So I've signed on with Patheos, and I'm writing a regular column with them weekly, publishing on my research. Patheos used to be sort of interfaith open discussion. They've sort of closed off the atheist end of things, but I try to remain sort of objective because this is psychological research that I'm publishing on. I'm not doing apologetics in that blog, but my Patheos blog is reporting on the research. I also occasionally post material to my Switching Sides YouTube channel. So I guess those are the main places you can find my material.
Thank you, Joel. Tyler?
Yeah, so The Freed Thinker, you can find it on YouTube. Anywhere where fine podcast material is found, you can download it on the streams, or you can come by the Freed Thinker group page on Facebook and join in the discussions there.
Cool. Thank you both.
Thank you.
And thank y'all for watching tonight. Appreciate everybody who's tuned in for the show, and look forward to hearing feedback and hearing all the comments as well.
Well, Caleb, where can we find you too, man? Come on.
Oh, over at Question Christianity. We still put together some of this. I guessed wherever as well. So,
all right, Dale, where can we find you?
Yeah, so I'm the host of Real Seekers. So I do a podcast with various guests on various topics and that sort of thing, including as is relevant today. I do have my Shroud Wars series where I bring on experts and stuff like that. So yeah, I think the next show in terms of my Shroud Wars will be with Dr. Ben Witherington III and Dr. Daryl Bach and Larry Stolley, debating whether or not the Bible even mentions the shroud. And there are about 4 texts that they're going to be discussing. So, yeah.
So I'm going to tell you guys right now that if you haven't listened to and you haven't done your research in the Shroud of Turin, Dale is the perfect guy to go to. And if you want to listen to his material on it, and I mean, he's got so much and it's phenomenal. Check him out, But until then, guys, like I said, me and Tyler are coming back. Dale actually is going to probably take a couple weeks off, but I'm not going to let him take a lot off because I'm going to actually rope him in several other shows as long, as well as Caleb. So you guys aren't going to rest that much. So just, keep that in mind. But until then, good night, guys. God bless and stay like Christ.